Bon matin à tous. Merci. So I'll take 10 minutes of your time and hopefully give you a quick and friendly introduction to X-rays, to CAT scanners, and if all goes well later today, you'll be able to impress your friends with your new knowledge. And the way I'd like to do this introduction is by actually introducing you to three important different people. Our first person is Wilhelm Röntgen. So I need you to go back to the year 1901. And in 1901, the very first Nobel Prize in physics was handed out. And as it turns out, it was handed to Wilhelm Röntgen for his discovery of X-rays. So if we have a look at his laboratory, or actually it's a replica of his laboratory, and we'll zoom in on his desk, we can see these are vacuum tubes. They're specific, this one's shielded by lead, but what Röntgen was experimenting with were different types of vacuum tubes through which he was passing electrical currents. It was known that these sorts of tubes could generate light, but what he was able to find is with specific types of tubes, by shielding them so they couldn't, no light could get out, he was still able to cause some glowing on these. He was using these phosphorescent plaques, and he was able to cause them to glow. So for him, what that indicated is that there was some sort of ray or of beam that was exiting the tube and making it to these plates. At the time, he didn't know what these beams or these rays were, so he called them unknown rays, or his shorthand in his books were X-rays. So the term X-rays kind of stuck. And with time, he was able to further develop this new technology, and he was able to capture images that were more permanent. This is one of his first X-ray images. It turns out to be his wife's hand. We'll speculate it's the left hand. This would be her wedding ring here. So this was the beginning of X-rays. It's quite surprising how quickly news of this discovery spread. This is an X-ray tube that was made in England, and it was only done a year after his discovery. He was quite a generous fellow. He didn't want to keep the patent or keep the discovery to himself. He wanted to share it. So within a year, we're seeing X-ray tubes being created across Europe. This is a picture of an early X-ray machine. This is from the London Science Museum, and it's a picture I happened to take last summer when I was visiting. Sadly, it also shows you what I like to do when I'm on holidays. I go around the world and take pictures of X-ray machines. It's not easy being a radiologist. So now if we flash forward, this is pretty much a modern X-ray tube, but the concept is the same from what was originally created. We have a current that's passed through here to a filament. We don't see the filament very well. The current causes the filament to generate electrons. There's a voltage across the tube, so the electrons come across and hit a little tungsten plate that's on the other side. The electrons interact with the tungsten and generate these X-rays that then exit the tube. Sounds a bit complicated, but really it's not all that different from something that we're much more familiar with, which is a camera flash. In a camera flash, a current is passed through a filament, and it generates, in this case, visible light. And then from your flash, the light, in this case, again, visible light bounces off an object or a person, and the light is captured in a detector. Your X-ray machine is really not all that different. You've got your X-ray tube that's in this portion here, and your detector that's up here. The main difference between the two is here you want to place your object or your patient between the detector and the flash. And with that technology, you're able to take X-rays like this X-ray of the skull. And essentially his original discovery before the Nobel Prize was 1895, so for about 75 years, we had X-rays that were being produced. The technology was developing, but there wasn't a great leap until this fellow came along. This is Sir Godfrey Hounsfield. He was an electrical engineer in England and worked for Electric and Musical Industries, or EMI was the company. His main interest was computers. So if we go back to 1958, he helped develop one of the first, I don't know if you call this a laptop or a desktop computer, a room full of computers. This was the first transistor-based computer that was built in England. So we're looking at 1958. The story goes that sometime after this, Hounsfield was out for a walk in the British countryside, and he started to hatch an idea where if you took an X-ray tube, and rather than a general tube, it would produce a beam that was almost like a pencil beam, and it would go across to a detector. And what he would do is he would move the tube and the detector along the object or the patient and take a series of measurements. As it turns out, for the first CAT scanner, it was about 80 measurements. Then he would move the whole apparatus 1 degree, take another set of measurements, move it another degree, take another set of measurements, and do this for 180 degrees. And then this is where his computer background came in. He would take that information, feed it to a computer, and also there was new mathematical formulas being developed at the time that would then allow for that information to be processed and to create a map or a picture of what was going on inside the object rather than just a single X-ray picture. And with that, I'm doing a bit of a leap here. We're going to 1971, but this was the first CAT scanner produced by EMI, and at the time just limited to CTs of the head. You can see how this is, we were looking before at the X-ray tube and the detector and how that part would move. Well, this was the basic concept. So the very first CAT scan of a patient, we're looking at 1971, was when the first image was obtained. And here's our first CAT scan slice. This is one slice of a series of studies. If you move the patient, you can take a series of slices. Each of these slices took 5 minutes to acquire. You compare that later, we'll talk about the modern CT, one slice, 0.3 seconds. So there's been a bit of development that's been done. So this is 1971 and our first CAT scan. The processing time for the first CAT scan, the computer processing time, 2.5 hours. So they weren't doing that many per day. A little side note about EMI is that there was no way they could know how profitable or how important CAT scans would become. And they had to put some money into this research. As it turns out, luckily, EMI had a rather successful musical division, and it was partially successful because in 1962, it had signed on these 4 lads here. You might know them as the Beatles. And so to a certain extent, you can say that the Beatles helped fund the development of the CAT scanner, to a certain extent. My third person I'd like to introduce you to is less well known than our first two. He doesn't have a Nobel Prize, at least not yet. He doesn't have a knighthood. He does have one big advantage, is that he's still alive and well and still doing research. And Dr. Willie Callender. And to explain a bit what he did, we'll start by explaining what happened with CT technology over the next 15 years after 1971. This is one of Toshiba's first, actually their first body CT. And so with the technology, they were able to do advances, obviously, in computer technology, detector technology, and they were able to start producing images that had a lot more detail. You'll notice again, and this will be a recurring theme for the next few slides, is that these are all CTs of objects that don't tend to move around very much like a head. It's easy to immobilize a head. The main problem that they were having is that, so in a CT you had the moving part to take the rotating part and the non-moving part on the outside. So for those 15 years, those two components were connected with wires. So no matter how fancy you were, how quickly you can spin your CAT scanner around, you had to untwist it. So when I started in Calgary in '94, we had one that was quite fancy. It did 2 turns, but it still had to untwist itself. That's okay for a CT of the head, but when you're doing, say, a chest or an abdomen, you have to ask the patient to breathe in, hold their breath, you do your 1 or 2 slices, then they breathe, you uncoil your scanner, you move them down whatever distance, your thickness of your slice, and you do it again and again and again. So to, say, scan an abdomen and a pelvis, you were looking at 20 minutes. So with 20 minutes, there'd be some movement. You could, if you were to inject a contrast or something, that you wouldn't get an image of the area over a short span of time. It would be over a long span of time. So finally, we'll come to Dr. Callender. And he, I don't know if he so much developed it, but he put in, because slip rings had been used elsewhere, but he developed the use of slip rings in CT. And this is the moving part of the CT here. So rather than wires, they started using these slip rings. And what it allowed the scanner to do is to keep moving. This portion here, this is where the non-moving part of the scanner connects to the moving part. And the connection was with these brushes that were developed. The brushes allowed the current to constantly pass from the ring to the non-moving part of the scanner. So the scanner could just turn and turn and turn as much as needed. So rather than taking a slice, what they could do, that the scanner would be the black line, is to gradually move the patient through the scanner and acquire a volume of information And as the scanner is turning, it looks pretty much like a helix or a spiral. So if you compare that to, say, this spiral staircase, this is where we had the development with Dr. Callender of the spiral CT or the helical CT. So if we look back again at our pictures, now we had a volume of information that was acquired in a short period of time. And this is when we were able to finally develop or to create these sorts of three-dimensional recreations. We had a volume of information, we had faster computers, but also we could start looking at things like vessels because we were able to take the image in a short period of time. Again, we'll notice that I'm still talking about the head and the brain. We were able to do some CT angio of the abdomen, the pelvis, but the idea of imaging a heart, which was completely unthinkable back in Hounsfield's time, and even still not really realistic with these scanners, was still not quite there in terms of imaging something beating quickly like the heart. Thank you.